Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ginnie-Graham Show. I am with Tulsa Mayor Monroe Nichols. Welcome. Thank you for joining me again this month.
Always happy to be on.
Well, I want to start by congratulating you on your stylish opening of the pool, jumping
Oh
in with
yeah,
the kids.
yeah. It was
I,
fun.
yeah, well, I look back. I think only Mayor Bill of Fortune has jumped into a pool for an opening. So, but
Oh man, I got to go back and review the footage to see who did a better job.
I would suggest a cannonball for you next time. I
Okay, so
mean,
here's the deal. I've gotten a lot of criticism about this. I had to get distance, so I didn't land on any children. So cannonball is, you can't get distance on a cannonball. So you got,
That's true.
yeah.
That would not have been a good photo op for you hurting
No,
a child.
no,
So,
it turns a good day bad real quick.
well, I know that we're in the middle of the summer and everyone's hot and miserable and not thinking ahead. So, but I want to think ahead for a minute for our talk this today. I've been spending a lot of time with people who are on the streets, who are homeless,
Mhm.
the advocates who work with them. And
Mhm.
this weekend, I'm profiling a gentleman who it's kind of a sad story. He was in the war. He's lived on the streets for 30 years. Was at the warming center and left when it closed. And his tent had been cleared, but there were no room in the shelters. So
Yeah,
he ended up getting frostbite, having feet amputations, that kind of thing. And so through that story, there's a worry of what's going to be coming in a few months because winter's coming in just like 3 or 4 months. So one of the things that you had brought up on the campaign trail was this idea of having a warming center open from like November to March. Other
yeah,
cities sort of do that,
yeah,
uh, just to guarantee that at least for those real frigid, dangerous temperatures, something's
yeah.
open. So what's the status of that? Is that happening this
Yeah,
winter?
yeah, yeah. The goal is still to get the winter weather shelter up. The goal originally was to get it open November 1. That date might fluctuate a little bit. But what we noticed this year, December, January, if I'm not mistaken, maybe in January, February, when the weather got super cold. Either way, our emergency shelters got to up to about 1,400 people, maybe even 1,450 and like 60 pets, right? And so we had to get those emergency shelters up in those days, which wasn't great because our just kind of everyday shelter capacity was already up above 100%. So the goal is still there. We could get closer to December before we get it up, but it would stay open until March. And then the thought is even when we have non-winter months, just because we know we do have some capacity issues. That site might also be a site for additional like day programming capacity, for some of the shelters that aren't open during the day. So that's still our focus. I mean, when I was on the campaign trail, actually, I met an individual that was somewhat similar. He lived kind of out kind of by 56th Street North. There's some kind of shaded area back there, and he showed me the tips of his fingers where the winter before they had kind of been kind of really dark and blacked out and rotted, and he had to go get the tips of his fingers amputated because of it. It is tough. I mean, we live in a community, as you said, right now we're miserable. It's almost 100 degrees, but in the winter, it got down to like negative 13, right? And so it's still a focus of ours, something we're very much committed to. We actually have a site at least that we're looking forward to being able to get that winter shelter on. Things take a little bit longer than I have an appreciation for, but we're certainly getting there.
So one of the not so secrets in the community, as I've been talking to people about this, is that the city and the county are talking about reusing one of the county facilities, maybe the old juvenile center, for one of these centers. Can you talk about that as
Yeah,
a possibility,
we've
or
well,
where
that not
it might
necessarily
be?
for that specific purpose. I mean, obviously, we have a need for additional shelter capacity across the board. And when, this spring, when I signed the executive order, one priority of this administration was to increase shelter capacity. And so we do think about that from the winter weather context that you and I just talked about. But there's also a need for a true low barrier shelter, which we do not have. And the conversations that we've had with the county and some other partners was around where can we invest in and build a shelter that can help meet people's needs, get them to a better outcome, with it being a place where people can go that we can help them really quickly. And right now, that's been the conversation with the county is what does a true low barrier shelter look like with a strong operator, something that is not just kind of maybe how we have a mental model around shelters, but a first class facility that is meant to improve outcomes for people. And that's been the conversation that's been had as it relates to potential sites, the old detention center being one. But it's been about the low barrier shelter, not necessarily about the winter weather shelter.
Okay. So one of the things that pops up is the idea of the clearing of camps, which the
Mhm.
public wants to see. I understand that. But there's this other very kind of a logistical issue of, as I'm talking to these people on the street, every time their camps are cleared, they're not necessarily going into housing. So they're going back to that place, or sometimes they go into a more public place where they're just
Sure.
sleeping on sidewalks. From a caseworker standpoint, and I didn't think about this, they said every time that something's cleared and they aren't coming into housing, they sometimes lose the process of getting SSI, or they're in the process of getting birth certificates and things to get them off the street. And I know that that's a struggle right now with that's a decommissioning process, right? Not only are you clearing the camp, but we're supposed to be giving housing. That
Right.
doesn't seem to be happening yet, mainly because of the infrastructure. So, kind of what are your thoughts on where that is at, the struggle
Yeah.
between
So,
clearing a
yeah.
camp and decommissioning a camp?
So there's a couple things that I would bring up on this front. We do a lot of clean outs where it's a health and safety issue. We saw a lot by the rivers. The river got really high. We see in some of the stormwater drainage areas where we are constantly working to clean some of those out because people could die if we don't do that right. And so you see quite a bit of that. My policy has always been we have an obligation to have an alternative for folks. And I think once we create those alternatives, there's an obligation for folks to take advantage of it. And so when you'll see us get aggressive on decommissioning is when we have spots for people, right? When we've done our job to make sure we have spots for people. I think that's going to happen in a couple different ways. We've talked about low barrier shelter. We've talked about winter weather shelter. The other thing that I'm not sure folks realize is that we don't have any more housing vouchers as a community. And so that means we're faced with trying to find, places for people to go. We have to pay market rate for and the expense associated with that. We actually do believe we have decent capacity on the market side. It's just super expensive. So like these are folks who aren't getting a voucher, so we're paying whatever rent costs at a place. And so that's going to be another strategy that we're going to employ. And so to the extent that we get enough places for people, you'll start to see us basically decommission zones of town, right? So we
Right.
can, be methodical about it because it's not just as simple as saying, "Hey, we're taking all your stuff and moving you out of here." I mean, it's, hey, Monroe, what are your needs? Make sure we match you with a service provider, somebody can check in on you, get you a stable place to live, and make sure we are serving you because we also don't want the bottleneck in transitional housing, right? Transitional housing is for people who are there for a little while and get onto a better situation. And so part of it is making sure the system's working overall. We have a bottleneck right now on the streets because we don't have shelters, we don't have places for people to go. But as those slots open up, as we create more spaces for people, you'll see us be more aggressive with getting people off the streets. And it is in part because, there is, if we're all being honest, some aesthetics to it. That is an important part of it. But the other part about it is that as we started this conversation, 100 degrees in the summer, -11 in the winter, being on the streets in Tulsa, Oklahoma is not a good spot for anybody. Maybe in San Diego or something like that, but like here, it's not a comfortable, compassionate thing. And I recognize that there's a lot of people who live on the streets who probably don't trust us to, and I get that. That's part of this. Why we have amazing outreach workers who are working with people every day. But our goal is going to be aggressive about decommissioning, but the obligation starts with ensuring people have a place to go. I'll give you a little bit of just a quick example. I spent last week with 47 mayors from 17 different countries. And a couple of those mayors, all of them, homelessness is on their list, right? A couple of them are mayors from cities who I've been sent who have really strong, aggressive enforcement issues around homelessness. And I'll just give you an example of one of those cities that I've been sent as a model of what we need to be doing to get people off the streets. Well, their point in time count was around 10,000, and they have like 6,000 people on the streets every night versus ours, which is a number significantly lower than that. The lesson from that is not that, that's a horrible community. It's that enforcement alone actually does not work. Enforcement alone just kind of pushes people into places. And I think that's where you get folks who might get more and more desperate. And we start to see some of the public safety related issues because we're squeezing people. And I think for us, we want to make sure we get them to a better situation. That starts with us making good on this obligation to create spaces which costs money, and in the city for a long time. It just hasn't been as deeply invested as I think we have to get there.
I've always thought that Tulsa has not invested in this where it should. We've always
Yeah.
sort of depended on philanthropists to do it. And so now we're playing catch up. And that brings
Yeah.
me to my question about the Improve Our Tulsa package had 75 million included in it in the last one for homeless initiatives. It was sort of undefined. I
Yeah.
know that is not available yet, but do you know the status of when that 75
Yeah.
million will
So
be
yeah.
available and how it will be used?
Yeah. It's a good question. So the 75 million was not necessary for homelessness. It was for housing. And I only separate those two because they're cousins, obviously.
Right.
We can't solve our homeless issue without addressing housing. And so the 75 million, we having active conversations right now about either bonding or borrowing money to be able to spend some of that early because we know we have an issue. If I'm not mistaken, the housing study that came out about this community in 2023, if I'm not, I could be wrong. I think it's 2023, said I think we needed 13,000 units overall in a decade, and just about 6,200 of those had to be at an affordable rate for people who were low or extremely low incomes. And that's the reason why we have a goal to get 6,000 out of the ground by 2028, right? It's directly, aligned to that housing study. And so some of that money will be spent, in the matter of, probably in the course of the next, 45 days or so. We're working through that. We put out a request for information to developers because what we want to do is make sure that if we have these public resources that are going out, it's going out in ways that people can spend it to help us get housing out of the ground. So whether that's land acquisition, whether that's rental assistance, whatever that might be, making sure that we're putting it out in places where people can utilize it. We also just got back proposals from an RFP for a third party to administer the program for us because we want to make sure we're doing it in an efficient way. Like the city, to your point, these aren't things we've done historically.
Right.
But that means we also don't have the muscle on how to do it well. And so finding third parties who actually have that expertise is a big part of what we're doing. I'll also just add, in addition to the work we're doing here at the city, there's also a number of other partners. The Housing Partnership Network is one of them that I'm thinking about off the top of my head, who's now here in Tulsa to help us do this work. Mercy Housing, which is one of the premier affordable housing, multifamily affordable housing developers in this country, now has feet boots on the ground here in Tulsa. So you're going to see an aggressive buildup on the affordable side, both from like our city dollars and from the private sector who's deeply invested in making sure we meet these goals as well.
Okay. Was there any money put toward homeless efforts in the recently passed budget from like the general fund?
Yeah, so there's a couple different places where our investment in homelessness shows up. So it's a little slightly different from the general fund in some ways, right? So there was uh, about $250,000 that was put in to support some of the decommissioning work. So making sure we're connecting people to housing resources, those types of things. But in addition to that, there was the opioid settlement dollars that we've been spending, like on rapid rehousing programs, which is north of a couple $1 million. There's another $6 million in ARPA funding that was actually supposed to be spent down a little bit now at the residential care facility, that we're really looking at how might that help us develop some other things to address. So if you were to cobble together everything that was in this last budget that is like strictly homelessness where we are spending against that number's probably in the $8 million range is my guess. I can get you a very specific number pretty soon, but just between opioid settlement dollars, the ARPA dollars, the little less than $250,000 that Councilor Bellis advocated there toward the end of the budget process, I think you're looking at around $8-ish million in spending on homelessness very directly, which is separate and apart from the affordable housing dollars that I was just
Okay.
describing.
but those will be going away eventually, opioid and ARPA.
Opioid won't be going away for a long
Oh,
time.
okay.
The
Well,
ARPA dollars have to be spent by December 31st of 2026.
okay.
So we have a runway there. Now, I will also say this, we, this budget was about half of me, half of Mayor Bynum, which is nothing wrong with that. But I think now, as we look forward, we are looking for places and space where we are now going to try to make the investments to ensure that they're there for the long haul. But what I would say is that whatever our investment might be, it should not necessarily be at that level forever. I mean, we really think about this from an outcomes improvement standpoint. It's the reason why when we think about shelters versus trying to get people in kind of market rate units, that we're not saying, oh, we need shelter capacity for 500 or 600 people, which is about the number of folks sleep on the streets every night, because people living in shelters is not our ultimate goal. But we recognize that's a real important part of the pipeline to get people to a better outcome. So the hope is that where we may have to spend in the neighborhood of 8, 10, $15 million a year on homelessness for 3 or 4 years, that number should take a dramatic drop at some point, because we've addressed the bottleneck issue, right? Which is
Right.
people can't get to shelter, so they're on the streets, and we're getting them into places and spaces where we're also helping them onto a better life, not necessarily just having them stay static. Because a lot of the folks who I've met on the streets, there's about a 300-day wait limit for housing right now, which it's wild to think that you got to wait a year. But there, I've met folks who have been, former teachers, people who may be situationally homeless. We've had a lot of conversation about evictions. In fact, we have an eviction mitigation task force that's going to be starting here pretty soon. People are homeless for a lot of different reasons, or right up next to it. And so the other part of this is making sure we don't have people who fall into it, right? So we're not continuing to feed the people who, but for having even if that hard time is a year, but for having that split, they would have been fine, because there's a tremendous amount of diversity in people who are on the streets, and some folks just need a shot. I'll give you just one other example. Emily Hall, who's the senior advisor of homelessness up here, she tells me that there's somewhere between 250 and 275 people that we just know right now who are living in shelters who go to work every day. That didn't even account for the people who are living on the streets who go to work every day, right? And so there's a lot of people who are out there who are going to work every day, who can't get on to the next step of housing. Helping them get there is going to loosen up a whole ton, and that I think that'll help them progress in their careers. I was talking to somebody yesterday at she works for the Oklahoma Technical College, the for-profit technical college, OTC, I think is what it is. They were talking about the numbers of their students who are homeless or living in shelters, right? And so if we think about just workforce housing for people who are trying to get their education but who are homeless, again, those are folks who, you start to think there is a pathway to improving outcomes for a lot of folks in a short amount of time. And so our investment in the things that we have to invest in now should have a dramatic drop off. It may take somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 or 48 months, but a dramatic drop off nonetheless.
Okay. So and this is sort of the last thing I want to talk to you about is recently the Eaton Square apartments, getting cutoff notices. This is the fourth one since November, and it had shades of Shadow Mountain.
Yeah.
If that shuts down, that's 448 people at least homeless overnight. So the other part of this is preventing homelessness. So
Yeah.
what efforts does the city do to prevent that from happening? I know that after Shadow Mountain closed, there were certain code enforcement type
Yeah.
things put into place. So, so what can you say about, Eaton Square, or how many other large properties are operating on that fringe of closure like that?
Yeah,
It's
there's
really
not
inviting.
many. Yeah, there's not many actually. I mean, the numbers that I saw is that they were like five who kind of fit that same category of like water cutoff notices out of like 3,200
Okay.
multifamily units. So it doesn't end up being a big deal. I think three of those five or something like that were actually on the Eden Square property as far as those
Okay.
multifamily buildings go. So it's not a huge issue. And cutting off water and stuff like that's kind of a matter of last resort. And so there's a lot of things that happen to try to mitigate that. They're all paid up, continue to work with that property owner to make sure they're not other things, like to make sure this is not warning signs of other problems, right? Nobody wants the Vista Shadow Mountain issue to pop up again is because it's about, how renters and how anybody should be treated when it comes to the dignity of housing. But it is a pretty small issue in the grand scheme of just the numbers of multifamily properties that we have. 5 out of 3,200 is low, but to your point, that's still a number of people. Like I always say,
Right.
when it comes to crime stats, if crime only happens to one person, but it's you, the fact that it happened to
Right.
nobody else is a small thing. So I don't want it to come across that, oh, this is such a small deal, we don't care about it. But knowing that we're tracking those things and understand where we are, it tends to be kind of the ones and twos, and certainly not the rule that a lot of properties are kind of in the same situation.
Okay. All right. Well, that is our time, and I always appreciate the time you give me each month. But as always, I want you to have the last word. What are some final thoughts you want to leave us with until we talk again?
I think it's always good in good times and bad to remind us all to be kind, give each other grace, especially when it's hot, because tempers flare when it's hot. But I really do. I really just want to say to everybody, it is an incredible pleasure. I was with 47 mayors last week. There's a certain amount of pride that comes with being mayor of Tulsa. I'm sure they all felt it, but I was the only person, who really felt it deep down because Tulsa's the greatest city in America. But I think a lot of that's because of the decency that we show. And I think, we have to continue to do that. And every challenge that we have here at City Hall, the things that we discuss on a daily basis, getting on the other side of them are all possible, but it starts with the level of kindness that we have to show each other. So that's what I would leave everybody with.
Well, those are great words. Thank you very much, and we will talk again next month. Thank
All
you.
right, take care.